commercialists would not have to search for outside markets which the other fellow covets. Ford admitted that munitions makers enjoyed wars, but he argued most businesses wanted to avoid wars and instead work to manufacture and sell useful goods, hire workers, and generate steady long-term profits. 54. Ford's British factories produced Fordson tractors to increase the British food supply, as well as trucks and warplane engines. When the US entered the war in 1917, Ford went quiet on foreign policy. His company became a major supplier of weapons, especially the Liberty engine for warplanes and anti-submarine boats. 9. 95 100, 119, 55. In 1918, with the war on and the League of Nations a growing issue in global politics, President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, encouraged Ford to run for a Michigan seat in the U.S. Senate. Wilson believed that Ford could tip the scales in Congress in favor of Wilson's proposed league. "You are the only man in Michigan who can be elected and help bring about the peace you so desire," the president wrote Ford. Ford wrote back, "If they want to elect me, let them do so, but I won't make a penny's investment." Ford did run, however, and came within 7,000 votes of winning, out of more than 400,000 cast statewide. 56. He was defeated in a close election by the Republican candidate, Truman Newberry, a former United States Secretary of the Navy. Ford remained a staunch Wilsonian and supporter of the League. When Wilson made a major speaking tour in the summer of 1919 to promote the League, Ford helped fund the attendant publicity. 57. 58. World War II era and controversies. Ford had opposed the United States entry into World War II, 44, 59, and continued to believe that international business could generate the prosperity that would head off wars. Ford insisted that war was product of greedy financiers who sought profit in human destruction. In 1939, he went so far as to claim that the torpedoing of U.S. merchant ships by German submarines was the result of conspiratorial activities undertaken by financier warmakers. 60. The financiers to whom he was referring was Ford Scott for Jews. He had also accused Jews of fomenting the First World War. 44. 61. In the run-up to World War II and when the war erupted in 1939, he reported that he did not want to trade with belligerents. Like many other businessmen of the Great Depression era, he never liked or entirely trusted the Franklin Roosevelt administration, and thought Roosevelt was inching the U.S. closer to war. Ford continued to do business with Nazi Germany, including the manufacture of war material. 44. However, he also agreed to build warplane engines for the British government. 62. In early 1940, he boasted that Ford Motor Company would soon be able to produce 1,000 U.S. warplanes a day, even though it did not have an aircraft production facility at that time. 63. 430. Ford was a prominent early member of the America First Committee against World War II involvement, but was forced to resign from its executive board when his involvement proved too controversial. 64. Beginning in 1940, with the requisitioning of between 100 and 200 French POWs to work as slave laborers, Ford work contravened Article 31 of the 1929 Geneva Convention. 44. When Rolls-Royce sought a U.S. manufacturer as an additional source for the Merlin engine, as fitted to Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, Ford first agreed to do so and then reneged. He lined up behind the Ware Fort when the U.S. entered in December 1941. 65. Willow Run. Before the U.S. entered the war, responding to President Roosevelt's call in December 1940 for the Great Arsenal of Democracy, Ford directed the Ford Motor Company to construct a vast new purpose-built aircraft factory at Willow Run near Detroit, Michigan. Ford broke ground on Willow Run in the spring, April-June of 1941. B-24 component production began in May 1942, and the first complete B-24 came off the line in October 1942. At 3,500,000 square feet, 330,000 square meters, it was the largest assembly line in the world at the time. At its peak in 1944, the Willow Run plant produced 650 B-24s per month, and by 1945 Ford was completing each B-24 in 18 hours, with one rolling off the assembly line every 58 minutes. 66. Ford produced 9,000 B-24s at Willow Run, half of the 18,000 total B-24s produced during the year. 66. 63. 430 Edsall's death. When Edsall Ford died of cancer in 1943, aged only 49, Henry Ford nominally resumed control of the company, but a series of strokes in the late 1930s had left him increasingly debilitated, and his mental ability was fading. Ford was increasingly sidelined, and others made decisions in his name. 67. The company was controlled by a handful of senior executives led by Charles Sorensen, an important engineer and production executive at Ford, and Harry Bennett, the chief of Ford's service unit, Ford's paramilitary force that spied on, and enforced discipline upon, Ford employees. Ford grew jealous of the publicity Sorensen received and forced Sorensen out in 1944. 68. Ford's incompetence led to discussions in Washington about how to restore the company, whether by wartime government fiat, or by instigating a coup among executives and directors. 69. Forced out. Nothing happened until 1945 when, with bankruptcy a serious risk, Ford's wife Clara and Edsall's widow Eleanor confronted him and demanded he cede control of the company to his grandson Henry Ford II. They threatened to sell off their stock, which amounted to 3/4 of the company's total shares, if her refused. Ford was reportedly infuriated, but had no choice but to give in. 70. 71. The young man took over and, as his first act of business, fired Harry Bennett. Antisemitism and the Dearborn Independent. Ford was a conspiracy theorist who drew on a long tradition of false allegations against Jews. Ford claimed that Jewish internationalism posed a threat to traditional American values, which he deeply believed were at risk in the modern world. 72. Part of his racist and anti-Semitic legacy includes the funding of square dancing in American schools because he hated jazz and associated its creation with Jewish people. 73. In 1920 Ford wrote, "If fans wish to know the trouble with American baseball they have it in 3 words: too much Jew." 74. In 1918, Ford purchased his hometown newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. 75. A year and a half later Ford began publishing a series of articles in the paper under his own name, claiming a vast Jewish conspiracy was affecting America. 76. The series ran in 91 issues. Every Ford dealership nationwide was required to carry the paper and distribute it to its customers. Ford later bound the articles into 4 volumes entitled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem, which was translated into multiple languages and distributed widely across the US and Europe. 77. 78. The International Jew blamed nihil the troubles it saw in American society on Jews. 76. The Independent ran for 8 years, from 1920 until 1927. With around 700,000 readers of his newspaper, Ford emerged as a spokesman for right-wing extremism and religious prejudice. 79. The Ford publication The International Jew, the world's foremost problem. Articles from the Dearborn Independent, 1920 in Germany, Ford's The International Jew, the world's foremost problem was published by Theodor Fritsch, founder of several anti-Semitic parties and a member of the Reichstag. In a letter written in 1924, Heinrich Himmler described Ford as one of our most valuable, important, and wit fighters. 80. Ford is the only American mentioned favorably in Hitler's autobiography Mein Kampf. 81. Adolf Hitler wrote, only a single great man, Ford, who, to the Jews, Fury, still maintains full independence, from the controlling masters of the producers in a nation of 120 millions. Speaking in 1931 to a Detroit News reporter, Hitler said, I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration, explaining his reason for keeping a life-size portrait of Ford behind his desk. 82. 77. Stephen Watts wrote that Hitler revered Ford, proclaiming that I shall do my best to put his theories into practice in Germany, and modeling the Volkswagen Beetle, the people's car, on the Model T. 83. Max Wallace has stated history records that Adolf Hitler was an ardent anti-Semite before he ever read Ford's The International Jew. 84. Ford also paid to print and distribute 500,000 copies the anti-Semitic fabricated text The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. 85. 86. Historians say Hitler distributed Ford's books and articles throughout Germany, stoking the hatred that helped fuel the Holocaust. 86. On the 1st of February 1924, Ford received Kurt Ludek, a representative of Hitler, at home. Ludek was introduced to Ford by Siegfried Wagner, son of the composer Richard Wagner, and his wife Winifred, both Nazi sympathizers and anti-Semites. Ludek asked Ford for a contribution to the Nazi cause, but was apparently refused. 87. Ford's articles were denounced by the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. While these articles explicitly condemned pogroms and violence against Jews, they blamed the Jews themselves for provoking them. 88. According to some trial testimony, none of this work was written by Ford, but he allowed his name to burst as an author. Friends and business associates said they warned Ford about the contents of The Independent and that he probably never read the articles. He claimed he only read the headlines. 89. On the other hand, court testimony in a libel suit, brought by one of the targets of the newspaper, alleged that Ford did know about the contents of The Independent in advance of publication. 44. A libel lawsuit was brought by San Francisco lawyer and Jewish farm cooperative organizer Aaron Shapiro in response to the anti-Semitic remarks, and led Ford to close The Independent in December 1927. News reports at the time quoted him as saying he was shocked by the content and unaware of its nature. During the trial, the editor of Ford's own page, William Cameron, testified that Ford had nothing to do with the editorials even though they were under his byline. Cameron testified at the libel trial that he never discussed the content of the pages or sent them to Ford for his approval. 90. Investigative journalist Max Wallace admitted that whatever credibility this absurd claim may have had was soon undermined when James M. Miller, a former Dearborn Independent employee, swore under oath that Ford had told him he intended to oppose Shapiro. 91. Michael Barkan observed that Cameron would have continued to publish such anti-Semitic material without Ford's explicit instructions seemed unthinkable to those who knew both men. Mrs. Stanley Ruderman, a Ford family intimate, remarked that I don't think Mr. Cameron ever wrote anything for publication without Mr. Ford's approval. 92. According to Spencer Blakesley, the ADL mobilized prominent Jews and non-Jews to publicly oppose Ford's message. They formed a coalition of Jewish groups for the same purpose and raised constant objections in the Detroit press. Before leaving his presidency early in 1921, Woodrow Wilson joined other leading Americans in a statement that rebuked Ford and others for their anti-Semitic campaign. A boycott against Ford products by Jews and liberal Christians also had an impact, and Ford shut down the paper in 1927, recanting his views in a public letter to Sigmund Livingston, president of the ADL. 93. Wallace also found that Ford's apology was likely, or at least partly, motivated by a business that was slumping as a result of his antisemitism, repelling potential buyers of Ford cars. 44. Up until the apology, a considerable number of dealers, who had been required to make sure that buyers of Ford cars received the Independent, bought up and destroyed copies of the newspaper rather than alienate customers. 44. Ford's 1927 apology was well received. 4/5 of the hundreds of letters addressed to Ford in July 1927 were from Jews, and almost without exception they praised the industrialist. 94. In January 1937, a Ford statement to the Detroit Jewish Chronicle disavowed any connection whatsoever with the publication in Germany of a book known as The International Jew. 94. Ford, however, allegedly never signed the retraction and apology, which were written by others rather. His signature was forged by Harry Bennett, and Ford never actually recanted his anti-Semitic views, stating in 1940, "I hope to republish The International Jew again sometime." 95. Grand Cross of the German Eagle, an award bestowed on Ford by Nazi Germany in July 1938. The German consul in Cleveland gave Ford, on his 75th birthday, the award of the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest medal Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. 82. 96. James D. Mooney, Vice President of Overseas Operations for General Motors, received a similar medal, the Merit Cross of the German Eagle, First Class. 82. 97. On the 7th of January 1942, Ford wrote another letter to Sigmund Livingston disclaiming direct or indirect support of any agitation which would promote antagonism toward my Jewish fellow citizens. He concluded the letter with, "My sincere hope that now in this country and throughout the world, when the war is finished, hatred of the Jews and hatred against any of the racial or religious groups shall cease for all time." 98. The distribution of the International Jew was halted in 1942 through legal action by Ford, despite complications from a lack of copyright. 94. It is still banned in Germany. Extremist groups often recycle the material. It still appears on anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi websites. Testifying at Nuremberg, convicted Hitler Youth leader Baldur von Schirach, who, in his role as Gauleiter of Vienna, deported 65,000 Jews to camps in Poland, stated, "The decisive anti-Semitic book I was reading and the book that influenced my comrades was that book by Henry Ford, The International Jew. I read it and became anti-Semitic. The book made a great influence on myself and my friends because you saw in Henry Ford the representative of success and also the representative of a progressive social policy." 99. Robert Lacey wrote in Ford, The Men and the Machines that a close Willow Run associate of Ford reported that when he was shown newsreel footage of the Nazi concentration camps, he was confronted with the atrocities which finally and unanswerably laid bare the bestiality of the prejudice to which he contributed. He collapsed with a stroke, his last and most serious. 100. Ford had suffered previous strokes and his final cerebral hemorrhage occurred in 1947 at age 83. 101. International business. Ford's philosophy was one of economic independence for the United States. His River Rouge plant became the world's largest industrial complex, pursuing vertical integration to such an extent that it could produce its own steel. Ford's goal was to produce a vehicle from scratch without reliance on foreign trade. He believed in the global expansion of his company. He believed that international trade and cooperation led to international peace, and he used the assembly line process and production of the Model T to demonstrate it. 102. He opened Ford assembly plants in Britain and Canada in 1911, and soon became the biggest automotive producer in those countries. In 1912, Ford cooperated with Giovanni Agnelli of Fiat